In 2009, a family of 4 from Phoenix, Arizona, vanished without a trace during what was supposed to be a weekend camping trip to Death Valley National Park, leaving behind only their abandoned SUV and a mystery that would haunt investigators for over a decade. But 14 years later, 2 experienced hikers would stumble upon a discovery so disturbing that it would reopen one of the most baffling missing persons cases in the park's history. The desert morning air was crisp and dry as Jake Thompson adjusted his backpack straps, the familiar weight of his hiking gear settling comfortably against his shoulders. Beside him, his hiking partner Sophia Chen checked her GPS device one final time, her breath visible in small puffs against the cool November air. They had been exploring Death Valley's remote backcountry for nearly a decade together, but something about this particular morning felt different. The 2 seasoned hikers stood at the edge of Badwater Basin, the lowest point in North America, watching the first rays of sunlight paint the surrounding mountains in shades of gold and amber. At 6:30 a.m., the desert was still peaceful, free from the tourist crowds that would arrive later in the day. This was their favorite time to hike, when the valley belonged only to them and the silence. "Ready for the Telescope Peak Trail?" Sophia asked, shouldering her own pack. Her voice carried easily in the thin air, though she kept it low out of habit. The desert demanded a certain reverence, a respect for its vastness and unforgiving nature. Jake nodded, pulling his water bottles from the side pockets of his pack to check them one more time. In Death Valley, water wasn't just important, it was survival. "Weather report looks good, should be a perfect day for it." They began their ascent into the Panamint Range, following a well-worn but challenging trail that would take them to the highest point in Death Valley National Park. The path wound through rocky terrain, past ancient Joshua trees and scattered desert shrubs that had somehow found a way to thrive in this harsh landscape. As they climbed higher, the valley spread out below them like a vast, otherworldly canvas. The salt flats gleamed white in the distance, while the mountains created a natural barrier that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It was beautiful, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. "The rocks above, you feel that?" Sophia asked suddenly, stopping mid-step. She had always been more intuitive than Jake, more sensitive to the subtle energies that seemed to pulse through the desert. Jake paused beside her, listening. The silence was complete, almost oppressive in its intensity. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of their own breathing and the distant whisper of sand shifting somewhere far below. "Just the desert being the desert," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. In all their years of hiking together, he had learned to trust Sophia's instincts. If she sensed something was off, it usually was. They continued climbing, but the strange feeling persisted. It wasn't fear exactly, more like anticipation, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. An hour into their hike, as they navigated a particularly rocky section of the trail, Sophia stopped abruptly. "Jake," she said, her voice tight with tension, "look at this." She was pointing to something partially buried in the sand and gravel beside the trail. At first glance, it looked like just another piece of desert debris, the kind of random object that sometimes found its way into the backcountry. But as Jake moved closer, his stomach clenched with recognition. Partially exposed beneath a thin layer of wind-blown sand was a small pink backpack, its fabric faded by years of sun exposure, but still clearly recognizable as a child's school bag. Cartoon characters that had once been bright and cheerful were now bleached and ghostly, staring up at them with hollow, sun-damaged eyes. "That's been here a long time," Jake whispered, kneeling beside the backpack without touching it. His hands hovered over the fabric, reluctant to disturb what felt like a gravesite. Sophia pulled out her phone, though she knew there would be no signal this deep in the backcountry. "We need to call this in," she said, her voice barely audible. "This could be evidence." Jake stood slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. If there was one piece of a child's belongings here, there might be more. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Remember the Morrison family?" Sophia asked quietly. "The ones who disappeared here in 2009. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Of course he remembered. Every serious Death Valley hiker knew the story. Michael and Sarah Morrison, along with their 8-year-old daughter Lily and 10-year-old son Jackson, had vanished during a camping trip 14 years ago. Their SUV had been found abandoned at a trailhead, but despite massive search efforts, no trace of the family had ever been discovered. Until now. "We can't touch anything," Jake said, backing away from the backpack. "This is a crime scene." As they stood there in the growing morning light, staring at the small pink bag that had somehow survived 14 years in one of the harshest environments on Earth, both hikers felt the weight of discovery settling over them. They had come to Death Valley seeking adventure and solitude, but instead they had found something that would change everything. The desert, which had kept its secrets for so long, was finally ready to speak. Detective Catherine Mills sat in her office at the Inyo County Sheriff's Department, nursing her third cup of coffee of the morning and reviewing case files that seemed to multiply overnight. At 47, she had spent the better part of 2 decades working missing persons cases throughout Eastern California, but none had haunted her quite like the Morrison family disappearance. The call came in at 9:42 a.m., crackling through the radio with the distinctive static of backcountry communication. "This is Search and Rescue Dispatch. We have 2 hikers requesting immediate assistance in Death Valley National Park. They've discovered what appears to be evidence related to a missing persons case." Catherine set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, her pulse quickening. In her experience, evidence that surfaced after 14 years was rarely good news. She grabbed her jacket and keys, already mentally preparing for what might be the breakthrough they had all been hoping for, or dreading. The drive to Death Valley took nearly 2 hours, winding through desert highways that seemed to stretch endlessly toward distant mountain ranges. Catherine had made this journey countless times during the original Morrison investigation, following every lead, checking every possible route the family might have taken. Each trip had ended in disappointment, adding another layer to her growing conviction that the desert had swallowed the Morrison family whole. Michael Morrison had been a successful real estate developer from Phoenix, a man who prided himself on preparation and attention to detail. His wife Sarah was a pediatric nurse, careful and methodical in everything she did. They weren't the type of people who would take unnecessary risks with their children's safety, which made their disappearance all the more puzzling. The family had planned a simple weekend camping trip to Death Valley, something they had done several times before. Michael had filed a detailed itinerary with park rangers, listing their intended campsites and hiking routes. They had proper equipment, sufficient water, and emergency communication devices. Everything had been planned perfectly, except they never made it to their first campsite. Their silver Toyota 4Runner had been discovered on Monday morning by park maintenance workers, parked at the Badwater Basin trailhead, with all the doors unlocked, and the keys still in the ignition. The vehicle contained all of their camping gear, food supplies, and extra water. Sarah's purse was on the front seat, Michael's wallet in the center console, and the children's electronic games scattered across the back seat as if they had simply stepped out for a brief walk. The massive search operation that followed had involved hundreds of volunteers, park rangers, and law enforcement officers. Helicopters had scoured the valley floor while ground teams investigated every possible trail and hiding place. Search dogs had been brought in, but the desert wind and extreme temperatures made tracking nearly impossible. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, the official investigation had been scaled back. The case remained open, but without new evidence or leads, there was little more that could be done. The Morrison family had simply vanished into one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. Now, as Catherine approached the coordinates provided by Search and Rescue, she felt the familiar mixture of hope and dread that accompanied every potential breakthrough. She parked at the Badwater Basin parking area, where a park ranger was waiting to escort her to the location where Jake and Sophia had made their discovery. "They're good hikers," Ranger Martinez explained as they began the climb into the Panamint Range. They know the rules about not disturbing evidence. Whatever they found, they left it exactly as they discovered it. The hike to the location took 45 minutes, following the same trail that countless search teams had covered 14 years earlier. Catherine tried not to think about how many times she had walked this exact path, hoping each time that it would lead to answers. When they reached Jake and Sophia, Catherine could see immediately that their discovery had shaken them. Both experienced hikers stood well back from the small pink backpack, their faces pale despite the desert sun. "How long have you two been hiking in Death Valley?" Catherine asked, pulling on latex gloves and approaching the partially buried bag. "Almost 10 years, Jake replied. "We've covered most of the park's backcountry trails multiple times. This wasn't here before." Catherine knelt beside the backpack, studying it carefully without touching anything. The fabric was severely faded, but she could still make out cartoon characters that had once been bright and colorful. The zipper pulls were corroded from years of exposure, and sand had worked its way into every seam and crevice. "Recent storms," Sophia offered quietly. "We had some unusual weather patterns last month. Flash floods in areas that haven't seen water in years. It might have uncovered things that were buried deeper." Catherine nodded, making notes in her field book. Flash floods in Death Valley were rare but devastating when they occurred, capable of moving massive amounts of sand and debris and revealing long-hidden secrets. She radioed for the forensics team, knowing it would take several hours for them to arrive from their base in Bishop. Until then, the site would need to be secured and protected from the elements that had already done so much damage. As she waited, Catherine found herself studying the surrounding terrain, trying to imagine what might have brought the Morrison family to this remote location. They had planned to camp at designated sites closer to the main roads, places with established facilities and easier access. This area was miles from their intended route, accessible only by experienced hikers willing to tackle challenging terrain. "There's something else," Jake said hesitantly, pointing toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards up the slope. "We didn't want to investigate on our own, but we saw what looks like more fabric caught in those boulders." Catherine felt her heart rate increase. If there were additional items scattered across this area, it might finally provide the evidence needed to determine what had happened to the Morrison family. But it also meant that whatever had occurred here 14 years ago, it hadn't been a simple case of getting lost in the desert. The forensics team would need to conduct a thorough grid search of the entire area, documenting every piece of potential evidence and testing everything for DNA. It would be a painstaking process, made more difficult by the harsh desert conditions and the passage of time. But for the first time in 14 years, Catherine Mills felt like she might finally be able to give the Morrison family the answers they deserved, and perhaps find some peace for herself in the process. The desert was indeed ready to speak, and Catherine was determined to listen to every word it had to say. The forensics team arrived just after 2 p.m., their white van navigating the rough desert terrain with practiced efficiency. Catherine watched as crime scene technician Maria Santos and her partner David Chen began setting up their equipment, their movements precise and methodical despite the challenging conditions. 14-year-old evidence in the desert, Maria muttered, pulling on protective gear. "This is going to be interesting." Catherine briefed the team on the discovery while they established a perimeter around the site. The pink backpack remained exactly where Jake and Sophia had found it, now protected by a small evidence tent that provided shade and blocked the desert wind. "We'll start with photographs and measurements," David explained, adjusting his camera settings for the harsh lighting conditions. "Then we'll carefully excavate around the bag to see if there's anything underneath." As the forensics team worked, Catherine climbed toward the cluster of rocks where Jake had spotted additional fabric. The terrain was treacherous, with loose gravel and sharp stone edges that could easily cause a fall. Each step required careful consideration, and she found herself wondering how a family with young children could have ended up in such a remote and dangerous location. The fabric caught in the rocks turned out to be a torn piece of blue denim, weathered and bleached by years of sun exposure. was caught on a sharp outcropping about 6 feet off the ground, suggesting it had been torn from someone's clothing as they passed by, or perhaps during a struggle. "Catherine," Maria called from below. "You need to see this." Catherine made her way back down to the main site, where the forensics team had carefully excavated around the pink backpack. What they had uncovered made her stomach clench with recognition and dread. Partially buried beneath the bag was a small white sneaker, child-sized, with traces of what had once been purple laces. The shoe was badly deteriorated, but the distinctive design was still visible. More disturbing was the fact that it appeared to contain something. "We're going to need to be extremely careful with this," David said, his voice subdued. "If there are remains inside, we don't want to disturb them unnecessarily." Catherine nodded, understanding the implications. After 14 years in the desert, any biological evidence would be fragile and potentially crucial to determining what had happened to the Morrison family. Maria began the delicate process of documenting and collecting the evidence. Each item was photographed from multiple angles, measured, and carefully placed in sterile containers. The backpack itself, when finally moved, revealed additional items buried beneath: a broken plastic water bottle, a handful of colorful hair, ties, and what appeared to be pages from a children's book. The words long since faded to illegibility. "This is definitely a child's belongings," Maria confirmed, examining the backpack's contents through the transparent evidence bag. "Age and gender consistent with the Morrison girl." As the afternoon wore on, the team expanded their search grid, working outward from the initial discovery site in carefully measured increments. The desert had clearly been disturbed by decades of wind and the recent flash floods that Sophia had mentioned, but experienced eyes could still read the subtle signs that remained. "Here," David called out, about 30 yards from the main site. He was kneeling beside what looked like nothing more than a slight depression in the sand, but his trained eye had caught something the untrained observer would miss. Catherine approached, cautiously followed by Maria with her camera equipment. David pointed to several small objects partially exposed in the depression: a tarnished metal watch, a broken cell phone that had been destroyed by years of exposure, and most significantly, what appeared to be fragments of adult-sized clothing. "This is looking more and more like a crime scene," Catherine said quietly, her worst fears beginning to crystallize. "We're not dealing with a family that got lost and died of exposure. Someone brought them here." Maria nodded grimly, beginning the process of documenting the new discoveries. The scatter pattern suggests the items were either dumped here hastily or disturbed by natural forces over time. Without more excavation, it's hard to say which. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Catherine found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. The location was remote but not impossible to reach with the right vehicle and knowledge of the terrain. More importantly, it was far enough from the main trails that casual hikers were unlikely to stumble across it. Someone had chosen this place deliberately. "We're going to need to expand this operation," Catherine told Ranger Martinez, who had remained at the site throughout the investigation. "This isn't a recovery mission anymore. This is a homicide investigation." The ranger nodded, solemnly. "I'll coordinate with park management to restrict access to this entire area. We can establish a temporary command post at the Badwater Basin parking area." As the forensics team continued their meticulous work, Catherine walked to the edge of the investigation site and pulled out her phone. Despite being in one of the most remote areas of Death Valley, she had managed to find a spot with minimal cell service. The call she needed to make was one she had been dreading for 14 years. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Detective Mills from Inyo County. I'm calling because we've found some evidence related to your family's case." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity before Linda Morrison's voice, older and more fragile than Catherine remembered, responded. "Evidence? What kind of evidence?" Catherine chose her words carefully. "We've recovered some personal items that appear to belong to Lily and possibly other family members. I need you to know that we're treating this as an active investigation." Now, another long pause. Are my grandchildren?" We don't know yet, Mrs. Morrison, but I promise you that we're going to find out what happened to your son's family. After all these years, we finally have a place to start looking for answers. When Catherine ended the call, she stood for a moment in the gathering dusk, listening to the desert silence that surrounded them. Somewhere in this vast wilderness lay the truth about what had happened to Michael, Sarah, Lily, and Jackson Morrison. And for the first time since their disappearance, Catherine believed they would find it. The forensics team would work through the night if necessary, using portable lighting to continue their grid search. Every grain of sand would be sifted, every potential piece of evidence cataloged and preserved. The desert had kept its secrets for 14 years, but those secrets were finally beginning to surface, and Catherine Mills was determined to uncover every last one of them. 3 days after the discovery, Catherine sat in the sterile conference room at the Inyo County Coroner's office, surrounded by evidence bags and preliminary forensic reports. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the photographs spread before her, each image telling a piece of the story that had remained hidden for 14 years. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the county's chief medical examiner, entered the room carrying a thick folder and wearing the grim expression Catherine had learned to associate with difficult news. "What do we have?" Catherine asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Dr. Vasquez settled into the chair across from her and opened the folder with deliberate care. "The remains we recovered from the child's shoe are indeed human. Based on the size and development, they belong to a child between 7 and 9 years old." Catherine felt the familiar weight of confirmation settling over her. Lily Morrison was 8 when she disappeared. The DNA analysis will take several more days, but given the circumstances and location, it's reasonable to assume these are her remains. Dr. Vasquez paused, studying the reports. "What's more concerning is what the bones tell us about how she died." Catherine leaned forward, bracing herself for what was coming next. "There are clear signs of trauma," the medical examiner continued. "Specifically, fractures to the skull that are consistent with blunt force impact. This child didn't die from exposure or dehydration. She was murdered." The words hung in the air between them, confirming what Catherine had suspected but hoped wasn't true. After 14 years of wondering, they finally had their answer, but it was the one answer no one wanted to hear. "What about the other remains?" Catherine asked. "The adult clothing fragments." Dr. Vasquez flipped to another section of her report. "We recovered additional bone fragments from the expanded search area. Adult male, based on the pelvic structure and skull characteristics. Also showing signs of trauma, though the remains are too degraded to determine the exact cause of death. Michael Morrison. Most likely. We also found traces of what appears to be adult female clothing, but no significant skeletal remains in that area. It's possible they were scattered by animals or moved by flash floods over the years." Catherine made notes in her case file, though her hands felt strangely disconnected from her body. After so many years of hoping the family might be found alive, somewhere the reality of their fate was almost overwhelming. "There's something else," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Something that doesn't fit the pattern of a random crime or family murder." She pulled out a series of photographs showing close-up views of the bone fragments. "See these marks here and here?" She pointed to several locations on what had once been Michael Morrison's skull. "These aren't random injuries from a struggle. They're precise, methodical, almost surgical in their placement." Catherine studied the images, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What are you suggesting?" "Whoever did this had knowledge of anatomy. They knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was deliberate, calculated execution." The implications of this revelation sent Catherine's mind racing. If the Morrison family had been targeted by someone with medical or anatomical knowledge, it narrowed the suspect pool considerably, but also raised disturbing questions about motive. "We need to re-examine everything we know about the family," Catherine said, closing the medical examiner's file. "Their friends, associates, anyone who might have had both the knowledge and the opportunity to commit these murders. As she drove back to Death Valley to continue supervising the expanded search operation, Catherine found herself reconstructing the timeline of events from 14 years ago. The Morrison family had left Phoenix on a Friday evening, planning to arrive at Death Valley by Saturday morning. Their vehicle had been found on Monday, meaning they had been missing for at least 2 full days before anyone realized something was wrong. 2 days was more than enough time for someone to force them to the remote location where their remains were found, commit the murders, and dispose of the evidence. But who would have that kind of detailed knowledge of Death Valley's backcountry, and why would they target a family from Phoenix? Back at the crime scene, the forensics team had expanded their search grid to cover nearly an acre of desert terrain. Portable lights had been set up to allow them to work through the cooler nighttime hours, and the site now resembled a small archaeological dig. "Detective Mills," called Maria Santos, who was carefully sifting sand through a fine mesh screen. "We've got something interesting over here." Catherine approached the technician's workstation, where several small objects had been laid out on a white cloth. Most were fragments of personal items they had already catalogued, but one item immediately caught her attention. It was a business card, laminated and partially protected from the elements by being trapped beneath a larger piece of debris. The text was faded but still legible. "Dr. Richard Hoffman, Emergency Medicine, Phoenix General Hospital." Was Dr. Hoffman connected to the Morrison family? Maria asked, photographing the card from multiple angles. Catherine felt her pulse quicken. "Not that we know of, but this could be the connection we've been looking for." She pulled out her phone to call the Phoenix Police Department, but the desert location meant no signal. "I need to get back to town and run a background check on this doctor," she told the team. "Keep processing everything else, but treat that business card as a priority piece of evidence." As Catherine drove through the desert darkness toward the lights of Bishop, her mind was already formulating the questions she would need answered. Dr. Richard Hoffman would need to explain how his business card had ended up at a murder scene in Death Valley, and why a family from his own city had been killed with the kind of precision that suggested medical knowledge. After 14 years of silence, the desert was finally starting to reveal its secrets. But Catherine had a feeling that the answers they were uncovering would lead to questions far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The Morrison family hadn't simply vanished into the wilderness. They had been lured there by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had planned their deaths with the same methodical precision they might use to perform surgery, and that someone was still out there. Catherine arrived at her office at 6 a.m. the next morning, armed with strong coffee and a determination to unravel the connection between Dr. Richard Hoffman and the Morrison family. The business card had been bothering her all night, its presence at the murder scene too deliberate to be coincidental. Her first call was to Detective Luis Morales at the Phoenix Police Department, a longtime colleague who had worked the original missing persons case from the Arizona end. "Catherine," Luis answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Please tell me you're calling with good news about the Morrison family." "I wish I could," Catherine replied, settling into her desk chair. "We found them, Luis, all 4 of them, but they didn't die from exposure." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. "Murder? Without a doubt, and we found something at the scene that connects back to Phoenix. I need you to run a background check on a Dr. Richard Hoffman, Emergency Medicine at Phoenix General Hospital." Catherine heard the sound of Luis moving around, presumably getting to his computer. "Hoffman, give me a minute to access the database." While Luis searched for information, Catherine spread out copies of all the evidence photos on her desk. The business card had been found approximately 20 feet from where Lily's remains were discovered, close enough to suggest it had been dropped by whoever was responsible for her death. "Interesting," Luis said, his voice taking on a more alert tone. "Dr. Richard Hoffman, age 56, has been an emergency room physician at Phoenix General for 18 years. Clean record, no criminal history, well respected in the medical community. Any connection to the Morrison family? Not that I can see immediately, but let me dig deeper." Catherine heard the clicking of keyboard keys. "Wait, here's something. In 2008, a year before the family disappeared, There was an incident report filed at Phoenix General. Sarah Morrison brought her daughter Lily to the emergency room after a playground accident. The attending physician was Dr. Richard Hoffman. Exactly. Lily had a severe allergic reaction to something she'd been exposed to at school. Dr. Hoffman treated her, and she recovered fully, but the report notes that it was a close call. Without immediate treatment, the reaction could have been fatal. Catherine felt the pieces beginning to form a disturbing picture. So, Dr. Hoffman would have had access to detailed medical information about Lily, including her allergies and medical history. It gets more interesting, Louise continued. I'm looking at Dr. Hoffman's schedule from October 2009, the weekend the Morrison family disappeared. He had requested time off for a personal trip. No specific destination listed. Catherine's grip tightened on the phone. We need to bring him in for questioning. Can you coordinate with Phoenix PD to locate him? Already on it. I'm sending units to his home address and the hospital. Catherine, if this doctor is responsible for killing that family, we need to move carefully. He's had 14 years to establish an alibi and cover his tracks. After ending the call with Louise, Catherine immediately contacted the district attorney's office to begin the process of obtaining a search warrant for Dr. Hoffman's property and medical records. The evidence from Death Valley, combined with the connection to Lily's medical treatment, would likely be enough to justify a comprehensive investigation. Her phone rang again 20 minutes later. It was Luis, and his voice carried a tension that made Catherine's stomach clench. We've got a problem, he said without preamble. Dr. Hoffman isn't at home, and according to the hospital administration, he took an indefinite leave of absence 3 weeks ago. Told them he was dealing with a family emergency. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. 3 weeks ago was right around the time we started getting reports of unusual weather patterns in Death Valley. The flash floods that uncovered the evidence. It's too much of a coincidence, Luis agreed. Either he's been monitoring the area somehow, or he has some other way of knowing that his crimes were about to be discovered. Catherine stood and began pacing her small office, her mind racing through the implications. If Dr. Hoffman had fled because he knew the evidence was surfacing, it meant he had been keeping track of the burial site for 14 years. The thought of him returning to Death Valley periodically to check on his victims' remains was deeply disturbing. There's more, Luis continued. I had a colleague check with the hospital's HR department. Dr. Hoffman has been taking regular vacation time over the past 14 years, always around the same time of year. Late October, early November, the anniversary of the murders. Looks like it, and get this, his vacation requests always mention destinations that would take him through or near Death Valley. Camping trips, photography expeditions, hiking adventures. He's been going back there regularly. Catherine felt sick. The idea that Dr. Hoffman had been visiting the murder site annually, perhaps to relive his crimes or ensure the evidence remained hidden, added a layer of psychological disturbance to an already horrific case. We need to issue a BOLO alert for him immediately, Catherine said. And we should check with rental car agencies, airlines, anywhere he might have used a credit card in the past few weeks. Already started the process, Luis assured her. But, Catherine, I think we should also consider the possibility that he might return to Death Valley. If he's been monitoring the site and knows we've found the evidence, he might try to destroy anything else that could incriminate him. The thought hadn't occurred to Catherine, but it made perfect sense. Dr. Hoffman had invested 14 years in keeping his crimes hidden. He wouldn't give up easily, especially if he believed there was still evidence that could be destroyed or moved. I'm heading back to the crime scene, Catherine decided. If he shows up there, we'll be ready for him. As she gathered her equipment and prepared for another trip to Death Valley, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. Dr. Hoffman had already proven himself capable of meticulous planning and cold-blooded murder. If he was desperate enough to return to the scene of his crimes, there was no telling what he might be willing to do to protect himself. The desert had revealed its first secrets, but Catherine suspected that the most dangerous revelations were still to come. And somewhere out there, a killer with 14 years of practice at staying hidden was making his own plans. The hunt for Dr. Richard Hoffman was just beginning, but Catherine Mills was determined to ensure that this time, the desert wouldn't be able to hide the truth. Catherine arrived at the Death Valley crime scene just as the sun was setting behind the Panamint Mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The forensics team had been working around the clock, and their portable lighting now illuminated an area that looked more like an archaeological excavation than a natural landscape. "Any sign of Dr. Hoffman?" she asked Ranger Martinez, who had been coordinating security at the site. "Nothing yet," he replied, adjusting his radio. "But we've got park rangers stationed at all the main access points. If he tries to get in here, we'll know about it." Catherine studied the surrounding terrain, trying to think like someone desperate to return to a murder scene. The obvious routes were being watched, but Death Valley was vast and unforgiving. Someone with 14 years of familiarity with the area might know alternative ways to approach the site. Maria Santos approached with a troubled expression, carrying an evidence bag containing what appeared to be fragments of paper. "Detective, we found these about 50 yards from the main site. They were buried much deeper than the other evidence." Catherine examined the bag under one of the portable lights. The paper fragments were badly deteriorated, but she could make out what looked like handwritten text. "What do you think they are?" "Medical notes, possibly," Maria replied. "The handwriting is very precise, almost clinical, and some of the words we can still read suggest medical terminology." A chill ran down Catherine's spine. "Like what?" Maria pulled out a magnifying glass and pointed to several barely legible words on the largest fragment. "Here, you can see allergic reaction, and what looks like epinephrine. And this section here mentions something about controlled environment and observation period." The implications hit Catherine like a physical blow. He was documenting what he did to them. "It gets worse," Maria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Based on the handwriting analysis and the medical terminology, these notes appear to have been written over an extended period. Days, possibly weeks." Catherine felt her stomach turn as the full horror of what Maria was suggesting became clear. "You're saying he didn't kill them immediately?" "That's what the evidence suggests. The notes indicate a systematic approach, almost like he was conducting some kind of experiment. The family may have been held captive for an extended period before they were killed." Catherine had to step away from the evidence table, the desert air suddenly feeling suffocating, despite the cool evening temperature. The idea that the Morrison family had been subjected to prolonged torture at the hands of a medical professional was almost too horrific to process. Her radio crackled to life. "Detective Mills, this is Ranger Station Alpha. We've got movement on the North Access Road. Single vehicle, no headlights, moving slowly toward your location." Catherine immediately snapped back to focus. "How far out?" "Approximately 2 miles. And closing. Should we intercept?" "Negative," Catherine replied quickly. "Let them come to us, but have all units ready to move on my signal." She signaled to the forensics team to douse their portable lights and take cover behind the rocky outcroppings that surrounded the site. If Dr. Hoffman was returning to destroy evidence, she wanted to catch him in the act. The desert fell into darkness, broken only by starlight and the faint glow of the moon. Catherine positioned herself behind a large boulder with a clear view of the approach route, her weapon drawn and her radio set to silent mode. 10 minutes passed in tense silence before she heard the distant sound of a vehicle engine being shut off. Whoever was approaching had stopped well short of the crime scene, probably to avoid detection. But in the clear desert air, sound carried much farther than most people realized. Catherine strained her eyes against the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. Then she saw it, a single figure moving carefully across the desert floor, carrying what appeared to be a large bag and some kind of tool. The figure moved with purpose, heading directly toward the area where the most significant evidence had been recovered. As it drew closer, Catherine could make out more details. Average height, thin build, moving with the careful precision of someone familiar with the terrain. When the figure was less than 50 yards away, Catherine activated her radio. "All units, Move in now. Suspect is on site. Powerful spotlights suddenly flooded the area, turning night into day and revealing Dr. Richard Hoffman standing in the middle of the crime scene, a shovel in one hand and a container of what appeared to be accelerant in the other. "Dr. Hoffman," Catherine called out, stepping from behind her cover with her weapon drawn. "You're under arrest for the murders of Michael, Sarah, Lily, and Jackson Morrison." Hoffman stood frozen in the spotlight for a moment, his face showing a mixture of surprise and calculation. He was older than the photos in his personnel file suggested, his hair completely gray and his face deeply lined from years in the desert sun. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "I was trying to help them." "Help them?" Catherine kept her weapon trained on him as park rangers and backup officers moved to surround the area. "By torturing and murdering them?" Hoffman's expression shifted, revealing something cold and disturbing beneath the surface. "They were suffering from a condition I was studying, a rare genetic anomaly that causes severe allergic reactions to environmental factors. I was developing a treatment." Catherine felt sick as she realized what he was claiming. "You used Lily's medical emergency as an excuse to experiment on her family." "The girl's reaction at the hospital was just the beginning," Hoffman continued, seemingly oblivious to the weapons pointed at him. "I discovered that her entire family carried the same genetic markers. They were perfect test subjects for my research." "You're saying you kidnapped and murdered 4 innocent people for medical research?" Hoffman's face took on an expression of twisted pride. "I was on the verge of a breakthrough that could have saved thousands of lives, but no one would approve human trials for my treatment protocols." Catherine realized she was listening to the confession of a madman who had convinced himself that his crimes were justified by scientific necessity. "Drop the shovel and the accelerant, Dr. Hoffman. It's over." For a moment it seemed like he might comply. Then with a sudden movement, he poured the accelerant over the remaining evidence at his feet and pulled out a lighter. "My research won't be destroyed by ignorant people who don't understand the greater good," he shouted, holding the flame close to the accelerant. The sound of multiple gunshots echoed across the desert as park rangers and backup officers fired simultaneously. "Doctor," Hoffman collapsed to the ground, the lighter falling from his hand and extinguishing harmlessly in the sand. As medical personnel rushed to treat his wounds, Catherine knelt beside the man who had haunted her cases for 14 years. His eyes were still open, still showing that disturbing mixture of arrogance and delusion. "The Morrison family," she said quietly. "Did they suffer?" Hoffman's lips curved into a slight smile. "They contributed to science, that's all that matters." Those were the last coherent words Dr. Richard Hoffman would ever speak. Dr. Richard Hoffman survived the shooting, though the multiple gunshot wounds left him paralyzed from the waist down and fighting for his life in the intensive care unit at Bishop Memorial Hospital. Catherine sat in the sterile waiting room, reviewing the preliminary search results from his Phoenix home, while waiting for word on whether he would be stable enough for questioning. Detective Luis Morales had arrived from Phoenix that morning, bringing with him a box of evidence that painted an even more disturbing picture of Dr. Hoffman's activities over the past 14 years. "His house is like a shrine to the Morrison family," Luis said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Catherine. Photos of them from the hospital, newspaper clippings about their disappearance, even copies of their medical records that he had no legal right to possess. Catherine looked up from the crime scene photos she had been studying. "What else did you find?" Luis opened his evidence folder and pulled out a series of photographs. A basement laboratory that would make a professional researcher envious. Microscopes, centrifuges, chemical analysis equipment, and detailed records of experiments he's been conducting for years. The photos showed a meticulously organized space that looked more like a university research facility than a home basement. Shelves lined with labeled samples, computers displaying complex data analyses, and most disturbing of all, detailed anatomical charts with handwritten notes covering every available surface. "The really sick part," Luis continued, "is that his research was legitimate. He really was developing treatment protocols for severe allergic reactions. The problem is that he was using human subjects without their knowledge or consent. Catherine felt her stomach turn. How many victims are we talking about? That's what we're trying to determine. We found records going back 12 years, all involving patients who had been treated in his emergency room for allergic reactions. But the Morrison family appears to be the only case where he actually kidnapped and murdered his subjects. A nurse approached their table. Detective Mills, Dr. Hoffman is conscious and stable enough for a brief interview, if you'd like to speak with him. Catherine and Louise followed the nurse through the hospital corridors to the ICU, where Dr. Hoffman lay connected to multiple machines, his face pale, but his eyes alert. 2 uniformed officers stood guard outside his room. Dr. Hoffman, Catherine said, settling into the chair beside his bed. You're under arrest for the murders of Michael, Sarah, Lily, and Jackson Morrison. You have the right to remain silent. I don't want a lawyer, Hoffman interrupted, his voice weak but clear. I want to explain what I was really doing. Catherine exchanged glances with Louise, then activated her digital recorder. This is Detective Catherine Mills interviewing Dr. Richard Hoffman at Bishop Memorial Hospital. Dr. Hoffman has waived his right to legal counsel. Hoffman turned his head toward her, and Catherine was struck by the complete lack of remorse in his eyes. The Morrison family was dying, he said matter-of-factly. All of them carried a genetic mutation that would have killed them within 5 to 10 years. That's not true, Catherine replied. They were a healthy family. You don't understand genetics, Hoffman said with a condescending tone that made Catherine's skin crawl. Lily's allergic reaction at the hospital wasn't random. It was a symptom of a progressive condition that would have eventually affected her entire respiratory system. Louise leaned forward. Even if that were true, it didn't give you the right to kidnap and experiment on them. Hoffman's expression took on that same twisted pride Catherine had seen at the crime scene. I offered them a chance to contribute to medical science, to help save thousands of other families with the same condition. You offered them. Catherine couldn't keep the disbelief out of her voice. Are you saying they consented to be your test subjects? Initially, yes. I explained my research to Michael and Sarah, showed them the genetic markers I had identified in Lily's blood work. They were interested in participating in a controlled study. Catherine felt a chill as she realized where this was heading. But something went wrong. Hoffman's breathing became more labored, and the monitors attached to him began beeping more rapidly. The treatment protocols were more aggressive than I had initially explained. When they tried to leave the study, I couldn't let them go. They had already been exposed to experimental compounds. Their blood work showed promising results. So you held them captive. I relocated them to a controlled environment where I could monitor their progress without interference from family members or other medical personnel who wouldn't understand the importance of the research. Catherine had to force herself to remain professional. The controlled environment was the desert location where we found their remains. It was perfect, Hoffman said, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. Isolated, climate-controlled with portable equipment, no distractions. I was able to document their responses to treatment over a 3-week period. Louise stood abruptly, unable to listen to any more. Catherine continued the interview, though every word made her feel sicker. What happened at the end of the 3 weeks? Hoffman's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of something that might have been regret. The children didn't respond to treatment as well as I had hoped. Their systems began to shut down despite my interventions. And the parents? Michael became uncooperative when he realized the children were dying. He tried to escape, to get help. I couldn't allow that to happen. The integrity of the research had to be maintained. Catherine realized she was listening. To a man who had convinced himself that murder was a necessary part of scientific methodology. So you killed them all. I administered a controlled substance to end their suffering, Hoffman corrected, as if the terminology made any difference. Their deaths provided valuable data about the progression of the condition and the limitations of current treatment protocols. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Hoffman providing clinical details about the torture and murder of an innocent family with the same detached professionalism he might use to discuss a routine medical procedure. When Catherine finally left the hospital, she felt emotionally drained and physically ill. In all her years of investigating violent crimes, she had never encountered someone who could discuss such horrific acts with such complete lack of empathy. Luis was waiting for her in the parking lot, smoking a cigarette despite having quit years earlier. "How do we explain this to Lily Morrison?" he asked. "How do we tell her that her family was tortured for 3 weeks by a madman who thought he was conducting legitimate medical research?" Catherine didn't have an answer. Some truths were too terrible to share, even with family members who deserved to know what had happened to their loved ones. But as she drove back toward Death Valley to oversee the final collection of evidence, Catherine found herself thinking about the other names in Dr. Hoffman's research files. If he had been experimenting on patients for 12 years, there might be other victims whose families were still wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The Morrison case was solved, but Catherine suspected that Dr. Richard Hoffman's crimes extended far beyond a single family in the desert. And somewhere in his meticulous research notes, there might be clues to other tragedies that had never been properly investigated. The desert had given up its secrets about the Morrison family, but it seemed like those secrets were just the beginning of a much larger and more disturbing story. 2 weeks after Dr. Hoffman's arrest, Catherine sat in her office surrounded by boxes of evidence that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning more than a decade. The FBI had joined the investigation, bringing with them resources and expertise that allowed for a much broader examination of Hoffman's activities. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had been assigned as the federal lead investigator, and her team had been working around the clock to identify potential victims from Hoffman's research files. "We've confirmed at least 15 cases of patients who were treated by Dr. Hoffman for allergic reactions and then disappeared within 6 months. Agent Torres reported, settling into the chair across from Catherine's desk. All of them had similar genetic markers to what Hoffman claimed to be studying. Catherine felt the familiar weight of multiple victims settling over her. Each name on the list represented a family that had been torn apart, loved ones who had vanished without explanation. "Any pattern to the disappearances?" "That's what's most disturbing," Torres replied, opening her case file. "They weren't all from Phoenix. We've got cases from Tucson, Flagstaff, even some from Southern California. Hoffman appears to have been targeting patients across multiple states." Catherine studied the map that Torres spread across her desk. Red pins marked the locations where victims had disappeared, creating a pattern that roughly corresponded to Dr. Hoffman's conference attendance and vacation schedules over the past 12 years. He was hunting them, Catherine realized, using medical conferences and personal travel as opportunities to identify and stalk potential victims. "It's worse than that," Torres said grimly. "We found evidence that he was accessing medical databases illegally, searching for patients with specific genetic profiles across multiple hospital systems." The scope of Dr. Hoffman's crimes was becoming clearer, and it was far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. He hadn't just been a doctor who had lost his moral compass. He had been a predator who had used his medical credentials to gain access to vulnerable people. Catherine's phone rang, interrupting her review of the victim files. It was Dr. Vasquez from the coroner's office. "Catherine, we've completed the full analysis of all the remains recovered from Death Valley," the medical examiner said. "I think you need to see what we found." An hour later, Catherine and Agent Torres stood in the sterile examination room at the coroner's office, staring at a display that made Catherine's stomach clench with dread. "In addition to the Morrison family remains," Dr. Vasquez explained, "we've identified bone fragments from at least 6 other individuals, different ages, both male and female, all showing signs of the same methodical trauma patterns we saw with the Morrison family." Catherine studied the carefully arranged evidence. 6 more people? The bones were buried much deeper and in different locations throughout the site, Dr. Vasquez continued. "It appears Dr. Hoffman had been using that location as a disposal site for years, possibly dating back to the early stages of his criminal activities. Agent Torres pulled out her phone and began making notes. This confirms our theory about the scope of his operations. Death Valley wasn't just where he killed the Morrison family. It was his primary dumping ground. Catherine felt overwhelmed by the implications. How many families have been destroyed by this monster? Dr. Vasquez led them to another table where personal effects had been laid out and catalogued. We've recovered jewelry, clothing fragments, and personal items that span a timeline of approximately 8 years. The oldest items appear to date back to around 2005. Among the items were a man's wedding ring, several pieces of children's jewelry, and fragments of clothing that told the story of multiple victims across different age groups and backgrounds. This changes everything, Catherine said quietly. We're not just dealing with one family murder. We're looking at a serial killer who operated for nearly a decade. Agent Torres nodded grimly. And he was sophisticated enough to space out his crimes geographically and temporally to avoid detection. If it hadn't been for the flash floods that exposed the Morrison evidence, he might have continued indefinitely. As they continued examining the evidence, Catherine's phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Luis in Phoenix. Major development. Found Hoffman's research partner. Dr. Jennifer Chen works at University of Arizona Medical Center. She's been cooperating with his experiments. Catherine showed the message to Agent Torres, who immediately called for backup units to be dispatched to Tucson. We need to get down there immediately, Torres said. If Dr. Hoffman had an accomplice, there might be active victims who still need to be rescued. The drive to Tucson took 3 hours, during which Catherine and Agent Torres coordinated with local law enforcement to establish surveillance on Dr. Jennifer Chen. The University of Arizona Medical Center was a massive complex, and Chen was a respected researcher in the genetics department. According to her personnel file, Torres said, reviewing the information on her laptop as they drove, Dr. Chen has been collaborating with Dr. Hoffman on allergy research for the past 5 years. She's published several papers based on data that we now know came from his illegal experiments. Catherine felt sick thinking about how many people in the medical community might have unknowingly benefited from research conducted through torture and murder. They arrived at the medical center just as the afternoon shift was ending. Dr. Chen was in her laboratory, working alone with what appeared to be blood samples and genetic analysis equipment. Dr. Jennifer Chen, Agent Torres announced as they entered the lab with campus security. FBI, we need to speak with you about your research collaboration with Dr. Richard Hoffman. Dr. Chen looked up from her microscope, and Catherine immediately saw guilt and fear in her expression. She was a woman in her late 30s, with precisely arranged appearance that suggested obsessive attention to detail. I don't know what you're talking about, Chen said, but her hands were visibly shaking as she spoke. Dr. Hoffman is in custody for multiple murders, Catherine explained. We've found evidence of systematic experimentation on human subjects. We know you've been co-authoring research papers based on his data. Chen's composure cracked completely. I didn't know how he was obtaining the samples, she said, her voice breaking. He told me they were from consenting patients who were participating in clinical trials. Agent Torres moved closer to the lab bench where Chen had been working. What are these samples you're testing now? They're from the latest batch, Chen whispered. Dr. Hoffman delivered them 2 weeks ago, just before he disappeared. He said they were from a family in Nevada who had volunteered for the expanded study. Catherine felt her blood run cold. A family in Nevada? Are they still alive? Chen's face went white as she realized the implications of the question. I don't know. Dr. Hoffman never let me meet the subjects directly. He said it was to maintain the integrity of the research protocols. Agent Torres was already on her radio, calling for immediate mobilization of search and rescue teams in Nevada. If Dr. Hoffman had been holding another family captive when his crimes were discovered, they might still be alive somewhere in the desert, waiting for rescue that might already be too late. As Dr. Chen broke down completely and began providing details about her unwitting collaboration with a serial killer, Catherine realized that the Morrison family case had opened a door to something far more extensive and horrifying than anyone had imagined. The desert was still giving up its secrets, but now those secrets extended far beyond Death Valley, reaching into multiple states and potentially involving victims who might still be saved. The race against time had begun again, but this time the stakes were even higher. The Emergency Command Center was established in Las Vegas within 4 hours of Dr. Chen's revelation. Catherine found herself in the surreal position of coordinating a multi-state rescue operation based on the confession of a woman who claimed not to know she was analyzing blood samples from kidnapped victims. Dr. Chen sat in an FBI interview room, her hands shaking as she provided every detail she could remember about her interactions with Dr. Hoffman over the past 5 years. He always delivered the samples personally, Chen explained to Agent Torres, usually late at night or early in the morning when the lab was empty. He said it was to protect patient confidentiality. Catherine studied the timeline that Dr. Chen had helped them construct. The blood samples from Nevada had been delivered exactly 13 days ago, which meant that if there was indeed a family being held captive, they had been missing for at least 2 weeks. Did Dr. Hoffman ever mention specific locations where his research subjects were staying? Agent Torres asked. Chen shook her head. He was very secretive about that, but he did mention once that he preferred locations with natural climate control and minimal risk of discovery. He said the desert provided ideal conditions for extended observation periods. Catherine felt her stomach clench. Extended observation periods was Dr. Hoffman's clinical way of describing torture and captivity. The search had been narrowed to a 50-mile radius around Las Vegas, focusing on remote desert areas with vehicle access, but minimal foot traffic. Satellite imagery was being analyzed for any signs of structures or activities that might indicate a hidden research facility. "We've got something," announced FBI tech specialist David Park, looking up from his computer screen. Thermal imaging from yesterday shows what appears to be a heated structure approximately 40 miles northeast of Las Vegas. It's not on any property records, and there's no legitimate reason for anyone to be operating equipment in that location. Catherine and Agent Torres gathered around Park's monitor, studying the satellite images. The structure appeared to be partially underground or built into a hillside, with only a small portion visible from above. "How do we approach this?" Catherine asked. "If there are living victims inside, we can't risk a tactical assault that might get them killed." Agent Torres was already coordinating with the Las Vegas FBI field office. "We'll establish a perimeter and use surveillance equipment to determine how many people are at the location. If Dr. Hoffman had an accomplice helping him maintain the site, we need to know what we're dealing with." The drive to the coordinates took 2 hours through increasingly desolate terrain. Catherine found herself thinking about the families who might be suffering in the remote location they were approaching. After witnessing Dr. Hoffman's clinical detachment about the torture and murder of the Morrison family, she dreaded what they might find. The FBI tactical team established their command post behind a ridge approximately half a mile from the target location. Through high-powered surveillance equipment, they could see what appeared to be a small concrete structure built into the side of a natural depression in the desert floor. "There's definitely activity inside," reported tactical team leader Captain Martinez. "We're detecting heat signatures consistent with multiple people, including what appears to be at least 2 smaller individuals who could be children." Catherine felt her heart rate increase. Living victims meant hope, but also meant that every minute of delay could result in further harm. "We're also seeing one larger heat signature that appears to be moving around the structure independently," Martinez continued. "Possibly a caretaker or accomplice left behind to maintain the operation." Agent Torres made the decision to attempt contact before launching a full assault. Using a megaphone system, she called out toward the structure. "This is the FBI. We know you're inside. We want to help any victims who may be held against their will. Please respond." The response was immediate and heartbreaking. Even from half a mile away through the electronic amplification equipment, they could hear the sound of children crying and what appeared to be an adult voice calling for help. "That's all I need to hear," Captain Martinez said grimly. We're going in. The tactical assault was swift and precise. The structure's single entrance was breached within seconds, and FBI agents poured into what turned out to be a sophisticated underground facility. Catherine followed the tactical team inside, and what she saw made her feel sick with rage and relief in equal measure. The underground space had been converted into a medical laboratory, complete with examination tables, monitoring equipment, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be holding cells. In one of the cells, they found the Peterson family from Reno, Nevada. Robert and Linda Peterson, along with their 2 children, ages 9 and 12, had been missing for exactly 14 days. They were alive, but showed clear signs of malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma. "It's okay," Catherine said softly, kneeling beside 12-year-old Amy Peterson, who was huddled in the corner of the cell. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." The man responsible for maintaining the facility was Dr. Marcus Webb, a former medical student who had been dismissed from his program for ethical violations. He had been working as Dr. Hoffman's assistant for the past 3 years, helping to maintain what Hoffman called his field research stations. "There are 2 other locations," Webb told Agent Torres during his initial interrogation, apparently eager to cooperate now that he faced life in prison. "One in Arizona and one in Utah. Dr. Hoffman rotates between them depending on which families he's studying." Catherine felt a mixture of horror and hope. More hidden facilities meant more potential victims, but also the possibility of saving additional lives. As the Peterson family was evacuated to Las Vegas for medical treatment, Catherine remained at the underground facility to oversee the evidence collection. The laboratory was even more sophisticated than Dr. Hoffman's basement in Phoenix, with equipment that could have supported legitimate medical research if it hadn't been used for torture. Among the evidence collected were detailed medical files on dozens of families, research notes spanning several years, and most disturbingly, video recordings of what Dr. Hoffman called his experimental protocols. Catherine couldn't bring herself to watch the recordings, but the FBI analysts who reviewed them confirmed that they documented systematic torture disguised as medical research. "How many more families are out there?" she asked Agent Torres as they prepared to coordinate searches of the Arizona and Utah locations. "Webb claims he doesn't know," Torres replied, "but based on the files we've recovered, we could be looking at dozens of victims across multiple states." As Catherine drove back toward Las Vegas, following the ambulance carrying the Peterson family to safety, she realized that Dr. Richard Hoffman's crimes were far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The Morrison family case had opened a door to a network of torture facilities that had been operating for years. But for the first time since this investigation began, Catherine felt hope. They had saved a family. The Peterson children would grow up, go to college, have families of their own. They would recover from their trauma because someone had been brave enough to expose Dr. Hoffman's crimes. The desert was still revealing its secrets, but now those revelations were saving lives instead of just exposing death. The Arizona facility was discovered empty, its concrete rooms still reeking of disinfectant and fear, but showing no signs of recent occupation. FBI forensics teams found evidence that it had been hastily abandoned approximately 3 weeks earlier, right around the time the Morrison evidence had first been discovered in Death Valley. The Utah location, however, was a different story. Catherine stood on a windswept plateau overlooking the remote facility built into the Red Rock formations near Moab, watching as FBI tactical teams prepared for what could be their most dangerous encounter yet. Unlike the previous locations, this facility showed signs of active resistance. "Motion sensors indicate at least 6 people inside," Captain Martinez reported through his radio. "But we're also detecting what appears to be improvised explosive devices near the main entrance." Agent Torres cursed under her breath. Dr. Webb mentioned that Hoffman had become increasingly paranoid in recent months. Apparently, he was worried about being discovered and had started booby-trapping his facilities. Catherine felt her stomach tighten. The thought of victims trapped inside a facility rigged with explosives added a terrifying new dimension to an already horrific situation. "Can we make contact?" she asked. Martinez nodded toward a communication specialist who was setting up a powerful loudspeaker system. "We're going to try. But if Hoffman left someone in charge with instructions to destroy evidence if discovered." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that they might be dealing with someone willing to commit murder-suicide, rather than face capture. The voice that responded to their initial contact attempt was thin and desperate, crackling through a hidden speaker system built into the facility. "Stay back," the voice warned. "Dr. Hoffman left specific instructions. If anyone tries to enter this facility, I'm supposed to activate the security protocols." Agent Torres took the microphone. "This is Special Agent Rebecca Torres, with the FBI. We know you're holding innocent people inside that facility. We want to help them, and we want to help you too." A long silence followed before the voice responded. "You don't understand. These people volunteered for the research. Dr. Hoffman was saving their lives." Catherine recognized the tone. It was the same delusional justification they had heard from Dr. Hoffman himself. Whoever was inside had been thoroughly indoctrinated with Hoffman's twisted philosophy. "What's your name?" Torres asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Dr. Angela Ross. I'm Dr. Hoffman's research partner. I've been continuing his work while he handles the legal complications." Catherine and Torres exchanged glances. Dr. Ross wasn't listed in any of the files they had recovered from the other facilities. She appeared to be a true believer, someone who had been fully converted to Hoffman's cause. "Dr. Ross," Torres continued, "Dr. Hoffman is in custody. He's told us about his research, but he's also admitted that his methods were illegal. We need you to release the people you're holding so they can receive proper medical care." The response was immediate and chilling. Dr. Hoffman would never admit that his research was illegal. He's dedicated his life to saving people with genetic disorders. "You're lying to try to trick me." Catherine realized they were dealing with someone who might be even more dangerous than Dr. Hoffman himself. At least Hoffman had maintained a thin veneer of rationality. Dr. Ross appeared to be completely detached from reality. "Dr. Ross," Catherine said, taking the microphone. "I'm Detective Catherine Mills. I've spoken with Dr. Hoffman personally. He told me about families with genetic disorders that he was trying to help, but he also told me that some of his treatment protocols weren't working as expected." Another long silence. When Dr. Ross responded, her voice carried a note of uncertainty for the first time. "The treatments are still experimental," she admitted. "Some subjects respond better than others. But that's how medical research works. There are always risks." "What subjects are you currently treating?" Catherine asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "The Martinez family from Salt Lake City. They've been here for 6 weeks. The parents are responding well to the enhanced genetic therapy, but the children are having some complications." Catherine felt sick. 6 weeks of captivity and experimental treatment for an entire family. She could only imagine what condition they might be in. "Dr. Ross, those complications you mentioned might be life-threatening. The children need immediate medical attention from doctors who aren't involved in Dr. Hoffman's research." "No." Dr. Ross's voice became sharp again. "External medical intervention could contaminate the results. Dr. Hoffman was very clear about maintaining protocol integrity." Agent Torres made a decision. "We're sending in a medical team. If you're truly concerned about the welfare of your subjects, you'll let our doctors examine them." "I can't do that. Dr. Hoffman's instructions were very specific. If the research is compromised, I'm supposed to initiate the security protocols to protect the data." Catherine realized they were running out of time. Dr. Ross was clearly unstable, and her repeated references to security protocols suggested she was prepared to destroy the facility rather than allow the victims to be rescued. "Captain Martinez," Torres said quietly into her radio, "we need to move now, before she decides to trigger whatever explosives she has in there." The assault was coordinated with surgical precision. While tactical teams created diversions at the main entrance, a specialized explosives unit entered through a ventilation shaft they had identified using ground-penetrating radar. Catherine watched through binoculars as the operation unfolded, holding her breath as minutes ticked by, without any sign of success or failure. Then, suddenly, the facility's main door opened, and FBI agents began emerging with what appeared to be rescued victims. Catherine could see adults and children being carried on stretchers, all clearly in need of immediate medical attention. "Martinez family secured," came the radio report. 4 victims, all alive but requiring immediate medical evacuation. Dr. Ross is in custody. Catherine felt a wave of relief that was almost overwhelming. Another family saved. More lives that could be rebuilt and restored. But as the medical helicopters landed to evacuate the Martinez family, Agent Torres approached with a grim expression. "Dr. Ross had a dead man's switch," she reported. "If we hadn't disabled it when we did, the entire facility would have been destroyed." She was literally seconds away from murdering an entire family to protect Hoffman's research data. Catherine watched as the Martinez children were loaded into the medical helicopter, their faces pale but alive. The thought of how close they had come to losing another family to Dr. Hoffman's madness was almost unbearable. "How many more facilities might be out there?" Catherine asked. Torres shook her head. "Dr. Ross claims these were the only 3 active sites, but we're not taking any chances. We're expanding the investigation to include a complete audit of every location Dr. Hoffman visited over the past 15 years. As Catherine drove away from the Utah facility, following the convoy of vehicles carrying evidence and suspects back to Las Vegas, she realized that they had reached a turning point in the investigation. They had saved 2 families and stopped an operation that could have continued killing innocent people for years to come. But they still didn't know the full extent of Dr. Hoffman's crimes, or how many families had already been destroyed by his twisted research. The investigation was far from over, but for the first time since finding that pink backpack in Death Valley, Catherine felt like they were winning the fight against a monster who had hidden in plain sight for far too long. 6 months after the last rescue operation, Catherine sat in a federal courthouse in Las Vegas, watching as Dr. Richard Hoffman was wheeled into the courtroom for his sentencing hearing. The months of investigation had revealed the true scope of his crimes, and the numbers were staggering. 47 families across 7 states, 138 individual victims, ranging in age from 4 years old to 63, 12 confirmed murder sites scattered across the American Southwest, and 3 families rescued alive, forever changed, but grateful to be breathing. Catherine had testified for 3 days about the investigation, walking the jury through each piece of evidence, each horrific discovery, each moment of breakthrough that had led them closer to the truth. Now, as family members of the victims filled the courtroom gallery, she felt the weight of all those lives that had been lost and saved. Lily Morrison, the grandmother of Lily and Jackson, sat in the front row. At 78 years old, she had lived to see justice for her family, though Catherine knew that no amount of legal resolution could truly heal the wound of losing her son's entire family to a madman's experiments. "Your Honor," said federal prosecutor James Mitchell, rising to address Judge Patricia Santana, "the defendant has pled guilty to 47 counts of first-degree murder, 32 counts of kidnapping, and numerous counts of unlawful medical experimentation. The prosecution recommends life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Dr. Hoffman sat silently in his wheelchair, showing no emotion as the prosecutor detailed his crimes. The man who had once spoken with such passionate delusion about his research now seemed deflated, reduced to a broken figure who stared at his hands throughout the proceedings. Judge Santana called for victim impact statements, and Catherine watched as family members approached the podium to speak about their lost loved ones. Each statement was a small piece of the larger tragedy, a glimpse into lives that had been cut short for the sake of one man's twisted vision of medical progress. Robert Peterson, father of the children rescued from the Nevada facility, spoke last. His voice was steady, but Catherine could see the tremor in his hands as he gripped the podium. "My children will spend the rest of their lives recovering from what this man did to them," Peterson said, looking directly at Dr. Hoffman. "But they will have lives to recover. My children will grow up, go to school, fall in love, have families of their own. The families represented by the people in this courtroom today don't have that hope." He paused, gathering himself. "We don't forgive Dr. Hoffman for what he did to us, but we thank the investigators and law enforcement officers who saved us and brought him to justice. My children are alive because people like Detective Mills refused to give up when the evidence seemed impossible to find." Catherine felt tears stinging her eyes as Peterson returned to his seat. She thought about all the nights she had spent reviewing case files, all the times she had driven through Death Valley hoping to find some trace of the Morrison family, all the moments when the investigation had seemed hopeless. When Judge Santana asked if Dr. Hoffman wished to make a statement before sentencing, Catherine was surprised to see him struggle to lift his head and speak. "I want the families to know," Hoffman said, his voice barely audible through the courtroom's sound system, "that I believed I was helping people. I believed my research could save lives." Catherine felt a surge of anger at his words, but he continued before anyone could object. "I was wrong," he said, and for the first time in all the months Catherine had known him, his voice carried something that might have been genuine remorse. "I convinced myself that the suffering I was causing was justified by the potential benefits of my research. But suffering is never justified. I destroyed families for the sake of an abstract scientific goal that I'm not even sure was achievable." He looked toward the gallery where the family members sat. "I know that apologizing means nothing. I know that my regret can't bring back the people I killed or undo the trauma I caused. But I want you to know that I understand now what I really was. I wasn't a researcher or a doctor trying to help people. I was a monster who used medical knowledge to justify torture and murder." The courtroom was completely silent. Catherine had expected Dr. Hoffman to maintain his delusions to the end, to continue insisting that his crimes were justified by some greater good. This moment of apparent clarity was unsettling in its own way. Judge Santana delivered the sentence. Without hesitation, "Dr. Richard Hoffman, this court sentences you to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole for each count of first-degree murder, to be served consecutively. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in federal prison." As Dr. Hoffman was wheeled out of the courtroom, Catherine felt a sense of closure that had been building for months. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the killing had been stopped. Agent Torres approached Catherine as the courtroom emptied. "The final forensics reports came in this morning," she said quietly. "We've now identified remains from 51 different individuals across all the sites we investigated." Catherine felt the familiar weight of those numbers. 51 people whose lives had been cut short, 51 families that had been destroyed, but also 3 families that had been saved, and countless others who would never become victims because Dr. Hoffman's operation had been shut down. "What about Dr. Chen and Dr. Ross?" Catherine asked. Dr. Chen pled guilty to conspiracy charges and received a 10-year sentence with possibility of parole. The judge accepted that she was manipulated and didn't understand the true nature of Hoffman's research. Dr. Ross is still awaiting trial for murder and terrorism charges. As Catherine left the courthouse, she found Lily Morrison waiting for her in the hallway. The elderly woman's eyes were red from crying, but her voice was strong when she spoke. "Detective Mills, I wanted to thank you personally," Linda said, taking Catherine's hands in her own. "You didn't just solve my family's case. You stopped a monster from hurting other families." Catherine squeezed the older woman's hands gently. "I'm sorry we couldn't save them, Mrs. Morrison. I'm sorry it took so long to find the truth." Linda Morrison smiled sadly. "You gave them justice. You gave them peace. And you gave me the chance to finally say goodbye properly." As Catherine walked to her car, she thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with 2 hikers finding a child's backpack in the desert, a discovery that had seemed almost impossible after 14 years. But that small piece of fabric had unraveled one of the most extensive serial killing operations in modern American history. The desert had finally given up all its secrets, and while many of those secrets were too terrible to bear, they had also led to the rescue of innocent lives and the capture of a killer who might have continued his crimes indefinitely. Catherine drove back toward Death Valley one last time, not to investigate or search for evidence, but to pay her respects to the place where it all began. The vast wilderness that had hidden so much death had also been the key to stopping future murders. In the end, the desert had chosen justice over silence, truth over concealment, and Catherine Mills had been privileged to be its voice. 2 years later, Catherine stood at the newly constructed memorial in Death Valley National Park, watching as families of the victims gathered for the dedication ceremony. The memorial was a simple but powerful structure, a circle of polished granite stones, each one bearing the name of a victim, arranged around a central fountain that reflected the desert sky. The Morrison family stone read simply, "Michael, Sarah, Lily, and Jackson Morrison. Beloved family taken too soon but never forgotten. Jake Thompson and Sophia Chen, the hikers whose discovery had started everything, were among the attendees. They had become unlikely heroes in the story, and Catherine had stayed in touch with them over the months following the investigation. We never imagined that finding that backpack would lead to all this," Sophia said, standing beside Catherine as families placed flowers at the memorial stones. "Sometimes I think about all the families that might still be missing if we hadn't decided to hike that particular trail that morning." Catherine nodded, understanding the weight of that thought. Random chance, a change in hiking plans, a moment of curiosity about something half buried in the sand. Any one of those small decisions could have changed the outcome for dozens of families. "The important thing is that you didn't just walk away," Catherine replied. "You recognized that what you'd found was important, and you made sure the right people knew about it." Park Ranger Martinez approached the group, carrying a folder of documents. "Detective Mills, I thought you'd want to know that we've completed the final environmental restoration of all the sites. Every location where evidence was recovered has been properly investigated and then restored to its natural state." Catherine appreciated the symbolic importance of that restoration. The desert had been wounded by Dr. Hoffman's crimes, used as a dumping ground for his victims. Now it could return to being what it had always been before his interference, a place of harsh beauty and natural balance. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the medical examiner who had performed the initial analysis of the Morrison family remains, was also present at the ceremony. She had worked tirelessly over the past 2 years to identify all of Dr. Hoffman's victims and provide closure to their families. 53 families now have answers, Dr. Vasquez told Catherine as they watched the dedication ceremony. 2 more victims were identified just last month from remains found at a site in Colorado that we hadn't previously connected to Dr. Hoffman. Catherine felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness that came with each identification. Every name they recovered was a family that could finally have closure, but it was also another reminder of the scope of Dr. Hoffman's crimes. "What about the survivors?" Catherine asked. "How are the Peterson and Martinez families doing?" "Better than anyone expected," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Children are remarkably resilient. The Peterson kids are back in school and participating in sports. The Martinez children are in therapy, but they're progressing well. All of them will need ongoing support, but they're building normal lives." Catherine thought about the difference between the families represented by the memorial stones and the families who had been rescued alive. The margin between life and death, between tragedy and survival, had been measured in hours and sometimes minutes. As the ceremony concluded and families began to disperse, Linda Morrison approached Catherine one final time. At 80 years old, she moved more slowly than she had during the trial, but her eyes were still sharp and determined. "Detective Mills," she said, "I wanted you to know that I'm establishing a foundation in my family's name. We're going to provide support for other families dealing with missing persons cases, and fun training for law enforcement officers working these investigations. Catherine felt deeply moved by the gesture. Even in her grief, Lily Morrison was looking for ways to help other people avoid the pain her family had experienced. "That's a wonderful way to honor their memory," Catherine said. "I also wanted to give you this," Linda continued, handing Catherine a small wrapped package. It was Lily's favorite book. She was reading it the week before they disappeared. Catherine unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a worn copy of Where the Red Fern Grows. The pages were soft from repeated reading, and she could see child-sized fingerprints on some of the margins. "I can't accept this," Catherine said, trying to hand the book back. "This should stay with your family." Lily Morrison shook her head firmly. "You brought my granddaughter home. You made sure that her story wasn't forgotten. I want you to have something that was important to her." Catherine accepted the book with deep gratitude, understanding that it represented more than just a memento. It was a connection to the child whose death had led to the saving of so many other lives. As the sun began to set over Death Valley, casting the familiar golden light across the desert landscape, Catherine found herself alone at the memorial. She opened Lily's book and read the inscription on the first page. "To Lily, who loves adventure stories. Love, Grandma Linda." Catherine thought about the adventure story that had begun with the discovery of a pink backpack and ended with the rescue of 3 families and the conviction of one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. It wasn't the kind of adventure that an 8-year-old girl would have chosen, but it was a story of courage, persistence, and the ultimate triumph of justice over evil. She placed the book gently at the base of the Morrison family memorial stone and stood quietly for several minutes, listening to the desert wind and thinking about all the lives that had been touched by this investigation. When Catherine finally walked back to her car, she carried with her a sense of completion that had been building for 2 years. The Morrison family had been found and laid to rest with dignity. Dr. Hoffman would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The surviving victims were healing and building new lives, and perhaps most importantly, a system of protocols had been established to prevent similar crimes from going undetected for so long in the future. The desert had kept its secrets for 14 years, but in the end, those secrets had led to justice and salvation for people who might otherwise have suffered the same fate as the Morrison family. As Catherine drove away from Death Valley for what she knew would be the last time as part of this investigation, she felt grateful for the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. 2 hikers on a morning adventure, a child's backpack partially buried in the sand, and a detective who refused to give up on a cold case had combined to stop a monster and save innocent lives. The vast desert landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, holding countless stories beneath its surface. But Catherine knew that some stories, like the Morrison family's story, were meant to be told, and when they were finally revealed, they had the power to change everything. In Death Valley, where the harsh beauty of nature met the persistence of human justice, the truth had finally prevailed.